welcome to the third in the series that Lindsay Armstrong and I are doing. This is, we're calling it George is Curious, because I am curious, and I'm curious to find out exactly how Lindsay sees both the present and also the future of the church in terms of these shifts from institutional inherited church to the church in the age of access. And in the first two episodes of this workshop, we spoke about shifts, firstly from churches which were started and sustained in response to demand, influx of people, everybody wants to come, bringing the babies for baptism, people want to get married in the church, the funerals are happening, the life of the church is vibrant and so on. There's lots of money, and Lindsay spoke about so much money spent, $1 billion in, was it 1960? I mean, that's unimaginable, a huge building project like that. Of course, South Africans, Zambians, Zimbabweans will also know of a time when there's great abundance. And moving from that to churches that start and or sustain insofar as they offer meaning. And people wanting to join churches to do meaningful things because they want meaning in their lives and having spiritual conversations. The next one was hierarchical to participatory decision-making. And Lindsay told a great story about a church that started when people started to talk and figure out why they wanted a common space. And then yesterday, we spoke about hard to permeable boundaries, very strong structures. And in the UPCSA here in Southern Africa, most churches have very strong boundaries. There's the pastor at the top and the members of the session, and the stewardship board and office bearers and so on, and ordinary everyday people who might have a great idea or a passion or a calling might find it very difficult to get a hearing. And then finally, we spoke about the leadership of the church. And Presbyterians are known for educated ministry. We don't ordain people unless they come with a degree from the seminary and they've been through all the checks and balances, the filters and the ordination exams and blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, many people in the life of the church, friends of Jesus, solid Christians, members of the congregation, have ideas and the abilities, catalytical abilities, to galvanize us into action, kingdom action. So thank you for those, Lindsay. And we're going to start this last session talking about the final two shifts that we've identified. And the first is from a material and financial capital, so to speak, to a reputational and social capital.
Yes.
Tell us some more.
A great setup. Thank you, George. One caveat that has been clear, or hopefully clear, in all three of the workshops, but we just want to make sure, is one thing as we jump into these last two shifts. We're not looking at full shifts like this no longer matters and this does. We're not talking about leaving behind that which was reigned as king in the age of institutions. Yes. We're not offering a prescription to follow or any sort of a how-to. That's not what anybody needs if you're in church leadership these days. And so just to be clear, what we may need instead, what may be of greatest benefit to all of us if we are to thrive in this new church environment that is emerging, is to become aware of these assumptions and biases that form the deep background against which we see the world, against which we do our church work. And it seems that examining these assumptions consciously simply allows us to re-enter our church world with an understanding of fundamental shifts in mindset that are out there, that show up in church as well, and that probably need to occur in order to deal with things that currently show up for you and your organization as problems. And so that's why this shift number 5 is so interesting to me and a little unexpected. Shift 5 is the shift from material and financial capital to a different kind of capital. In the age of institutions, material, financial capital, it was king. It was of paramount importance. And in the age of access, reputational and social capital are fundamental. Now, to be clear, as with other transformations, financial and material, this cannot be ignored. However, they in and of themselves are insufficient. And that can be said about almost all of these shifts. What we're coming out of, it can't be ignored, but in and of themselves, they aren't sufficient. And so now, in the ecosystem that's emerging, reputational and social capital cannot be underestimated. It might actually be a piece of what you need to address whatever your church is facing that you are naming as a problem. So continue on, George, or shall I pause right there?
Yeah, no, I think it's important. Well, perhaps we should pause and just talk about finances for a minute. I know it's something that we need to move away from in terms of a focus to a more reputational and what is the other one that you call a social capital. But in terms of finance, so what you're saying is it's not unimportant. We still need to pay the bills,
Yes.
and there are still going to be expenses, even in the most uninstitutional congregation, even in something which has got very little infrastructure, so to speak. But it doesn't get to set the agenda anymore, is what I'm hearing. It doesn't get to determine what we do and what we don't do. I mean, I remember, and I'm sure you will remember, conversations from your ministry where people said, listen, we need to fundraise for this, refurbishment of this area or that. And if we don't get, the buy-in, we're not going to do it. And I think that we're moving into an era where we've learned enough to know that sometimes we need to forge ahead in the knowledge that God will provide, and He has in the past, and He'll do it again. And there's not only one way to pay the bill. You don't have to raise 100% of the money before you start the job. And that's not recklessness. That's simply having a different perspective on things. So I guess that.
And in a way, these shifts, including this one, are indeed all about different ways God is now providing. And this one, it's not the case that financial material doesn't matter. It's critical. Financial and material capital absolutely matters. It's just not paramount and the only way to get it done, because with social and reputational capital that comes from deep relationships, being deeply embedded in a community and with a certain sense of call for your church, it makes relationships outside of the church, which often open the doors needed to get things done in a church. We're seeing this over and over again. I mean, churches everywhere are dealing with money, and it is hard. I mean, tanking economies, erosion of the middle class.
Yes.
Public belt tightening. These are difficult realities that are hitting every church, almost every church, really hard. And yet, forging ahead, sometimes we do need to make tricky and tough decisions about what to cut back on. We can no longer arrange our church life like we did 10 years ago because it's no longer financially sustainable. That is just a hard reality that we need to face sometimes.
Right.
But when there is something in your church that comes from deep within your why your church has been called into being, what God is wanting to do through you and your church, and that why, this thing that is happening in our lives, in the world, in the local culture, when that turns into a therefore we need to do this and here's how we'll do it thing, and then you have to figure out how to raise the money to make that happen, it's often participatory decision making that can help you find unexpected and more inexpensive means to take on the challenge at hand.
Right.
If there's always access, or there's at least typically access, and I'm hearing amazing stories over and over again, access to essential resources, if you have the reputational and social capital needed to get them. I know an entire church whose whole operating budget is crowdfunded through Kickstarter and GoFundMe.
Wow.
That's it. The whole church.
Yes.
Now, they are working on doing church in leaner ways. And it's not only about leveraging technology. It goes one step further. It's that good reputation and communication of a leader who is building relationships in the larger community with a larger network of people who are also feeling called toward this, that, or the other, that helps secure volunteers, material goods, fundraising. I'm thinking about Shalom. Shalom International has a signature ministry called Inspire, and it's an after-school initiative for middle school students who are our 6th, 7th, 8th graders, roughly around in here. Now, they are located in Clarkston, Georgia, which is an area where the entire state of Georgia, 9th largest state in the United States, decides to take all refugees assigned to Georgia and relocate them to Clarkston. The community opened its arms wide, was very excited. Most states break it up so that, people don't have to be right next door to somebody that they were trying to escape, for example, if they're coming out of a situation of war. But this is how Georgia does it. So Inspire provides after-school programming for middle school-aged refugee youth, many of whom have experienced a lot of interrupted formal education or very little of it.
Yes.
And as English language learners, they're facing a lot of challenges adjusting to middle school while also navigating a new educational system, language, cultural context, etc. Shalom, through their Inspire program, basically provides 5-day-a-week after-school programming that focuses on academics, social, play. You have to have some fun, and there's one other thing, I can't remember what it is at the moment. The bottom line is they have a large waiting list. They can only really afford to have about 30 kids in the program for the year, and the way they fund it, they also, and this is an important part of their funding strategy, they also have a family development component where they go and visit with the family so the parents don't get left behind while their kids are, So the way they fund all of this, they simply ask people who are volunteers, who are teachers, who are the students, to share their story through emails, through Facebook posts, through appeals of their own choosing. No one edits or reviews these personal appeals. The effort is completely decentralized. And what happens is they ask everybody involved with Inspire to simply share their story and ask if anybody who is able to help contribute money could do so.
Yes.
And they have tried to raise money 1,000 ways. It is this way, letting people in a decentralized manner tell their own stories, that change happens and support comes through.
Wow.
So this is an expensive project, a really critical project, but it's through the storytelling that each individual does that actually brings in the money that they need. They don't have the financial capital, but they have the social wealth. They have people who are interested in them, who know that their lives matter, who are connected, and they will tell stories.
Yes.
And that is how they raise the money.
Right.
What about you, George? What do you see in this?
I'm just fascinated by that because I think it's a very different way of thinking about church finance and stewardship generosity than the average person here in Southern Africa would be used to. But I mean, there are also absurd stories about finance, and also stories that, from our context and yours, and that and also stories that are quite surprising because no one expected this thing to happen, and it just happened like it did. So the first one that comes to mind is a colleague of mine was in conversation with an American pastor once, and this American pastor came from a large high steeple church in the American South, and a significant church, and he talked about endowments, people leaving money in their estate to the church, and we also experience that from time to time. But this person left money to endow the parlor. Now, for South Africans, the parlor is a lounge or a sitting room, and the notion of somebody wanting to endow that sort of a room in a church would, for us, be very hard to understand. But this colleague from the States said, well, what they do is they just order supplies for the parlor, whether it be chairs or stationery or whatever, and then they redistribute it to other parts of the church, because the thing is so absurd. It can't really practically, be managed. So, I mean, a thing like that, crazy. But on the other hand, we had a situation when I was a young minister, an inner city church in one of our cities here in South Africa was becoming very small, and its members were aging, and it wasn't necessarily attracting the young families and so on that were living out in the suburbs and were not willing to drive in anymore. And there was a chance of that church having to close, but what happened was that a music school approached them. They had beautiful buildings in the inner city, and a music school approached them and said, "We have an offer to make you, and that is, we would like to buy these buildings, but give you a life right to the sanctuary. We don't want to." The sanctuary was right in the middle. It wasn't the whole complex, and it was not very huge. It was modest. So we'll give you that in perpetuity as part of the deal. And this church, in the situation that they said fine, and they were able to have a life and even grow a little after that, and not have the constraints of a very expensive, beautiful suite of buildings that needed to be maintained and so on. And when they were in church, chances were the music school was not operating, and vice versa. When the music school was operating, the church people weren't there. But a symbiotic relationship, and that was kind of something for us to. It was a mind shift because we were used to owning our own buildings and doing as we like in our buildings, and quite frankly, not using our buildings to their capacity of use. Just when when we're doing things. So those two things really remind me that when you're talking about infrastructure and capital and finances, there are different ways, to fund. And you've raised an outstanding way, and that is to find your passion or your calling, and that might also generate income for you as you do the work in the community that God is calling all of us to do.
Yeah. Having a good reputation, and then the social capital that goes with that really does open doors. If you can engender trust, if you have connections, if people think highly of the really important ministry that's being done, it opens doors to unexpected income. We have a private school that now fundraises for a particular program of a particular church because the students got so excited about what they saw happening. And so these are 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are raising about $10,000 a year just to fund this one particular program because of the impact it was having and the relationships that they had with people who were leading that ministry. I think, George, you also just raised an interesting point that I've seen over and over again, but I hadn't remembered it until now. When you were talking about the building and how we use our buildings and do we need to own them? Some of us, yes, we need to own our building. Others, we might be better off either co-opting a building or using some shared workspace or something. There's a lot of interesting possibilities there. But in this shift, which is they're never a shift completely away from one thing into another. We're just looking at postures and mindsets that are really important to the emerging era and the people in it.
Yeah.
I watched a church close and be highly disregarded, looked down upon by the neighborhood around it because of the way they used their building.
Wow.
They only used it, mostly Sundays, some Wednesday nights, and a little bit one other night of the week. And the neighborhood felt like they had to deal with an empty building while everybody else lived a little bit farther away from the building and only stopped by once or twice or maybe 3 times a week. And so that material and financial capital, it's still important. And it can be important in a good way, or it can be important in a detrimental way. As you're suggesting, how we use our endowments, if people see wasteful, that hurts us. How we use our building, if people see empty buildings when there are people and groups and individuals who need a roof over their head for this work or that work or whatever, and they see our empty buildings, it speaks, yeah. So there's a downside to it. But how we steward what we do have, what this shift invites is attention, not first and primarily just to material and financial. It
Yes.
invites attention to the reputation that we have, the social capital that we have as a combined church, as well as individuals within the church.
Yes. Wow.
And yeah, and I guess one thing I would say is this, one more thing I would say is this. The church in general, we've never found our power in wealth. There is power in wealth, and it is a gift of God. And we give great thanks to those who have it and share it, and that we all contribute.
Right.
But the church, we've never found our power in wealth. We've instead found our power in relationships, and in particular, relationships born of the relationship with the living God.
Right.
And so, as with churches everywhere, our value has always been based on something intangible. And churches in the emerging era are relying on material and financial capital, yes. But far more, what's getting them down the road much farther is reputational and social wealth to go along with it, and which builds it out even further.
Right. And one of the stories I like to tell, and I've told you before, is when I was visiting in New York City with a church, with a pioneer who is working at putting together faith communities there. I asked him about his primary sort of audience, the group that he was aimed at, and I was very taken aback to discover that the people who he was really working with were those who had left church, the D church, people who were part of a Christian community and for some reason felt that the community was disingenuous. There was what is often called gaslighting or manipulativeness, or the kind of behavior that made people feel excluded. And so one of the ways in which they encouraged people to come to their churches, they would go down on the subway and hand out gum, and it had been specially made with a branding of the church and where it is. And then the slogan was, "Come and see a church that doesn't suck." And it was a very jarring example, but an indictment. And I started to think, what are the ways in which we do things that are just distasteful, or behave in ways because we think we have some sort of spiritual superiority and arrogance that turn people away? And what does that do to our reputational capital? What do people think of us? You mentioned use of buildings, but just common behavior. What is, there's always room for one more hypocrite, is what I say. So I think it's very, very important to work on those things. And in the process, we might discover people attracted to us simply by our own vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And it shapes how we expect to spend time.
Right.
They're just relationships with people beyond the church that are absolutely critical and that are just as important as those within the church. And we can get too caught up in it. Oh no, what do people think? That's not what we're really after. But right. A question is, with how much vigor does your church value reputational and social capital?
Yeah.
We look at financials every month. What do we look at in terms of reputational and social capital? What do we look at in terms of our community relationships every month?
And it's a very different question from from thinking that we need to justify our sense of being. It's not asking people to be it's not a marketing exercise. It's really an honest look at ourselves, a sober look at ourselves, and saying, what kind of image are we portraying? What values do we espouse, in the name of Christ? And to be frank, what would Christ say if he looked at us? You might just take a stroll through the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation to see the variety of what Christ thinks of us. But anyway, Lindsay, we're coming to the end of our 3 sessions, and we're now on to the last shift. And you talk about in the age of institutions, we were the church gathered. But now in the age of access, we are the church scattered. And what better year than this one to have experienced the scattered church? What do you mean when you talk about that? Characterize it for us. What is the church gathered for you? And then What is the church gathered?
Yeah. Well, and we're always both. I think that in the age of institutions, there was a real focus on the church gathered. And what I mean by that is energy, imagination, time. It was largely poured into Sunday morning, evening
Yes.
worship services, the midweek suppers, the youth group, the Sunday school, the special events, etc. These types of programs were viewed as central to doing and being church. And they were typically moments in a church's life where the community gathered together, usually in a building used so often for such purposes that we bought the building. We own it. A major part of the budget sourced the events and staff and facilities needed to support that which happens when the church gathers. And what I mean by the church gathers is time and money spent. It reveals our values. How we spend tells the truth about our priorities in ways that our mouths may not. And the church in the age of access being just as much or even a little bit more focused on the church scattered still means gathering is hugely important. I think we all know that in a really palpable way during this pandemic. I'm sure that you all, just as much as the people I know, are so safe, but we are really wanting to gather.
Right.
Gathering has always been indispensable to the nature of the people of God. I mean, in the scriptures, it's among the first and foremost activities. But focusing on the church scattered also starts to build into the church's life a sensibility that we are called for specific purposes, and that as we go out, we come back together, we are nurtured, we are fresh, we are renewed, and then we go back out as Christ's disciples in the world, called for specific purposes. And therefore, the focus on the church scattered looks at how we are when we're not together, what our Christian witness looks like. An example, there's a group called Crossline Ministry Group. They actually have a Spanish name because it's largely Spanish speakers. And so that's what it translates for, but they're a church. And they're a church of like 400, 500, 600 people. And they spend their monthly leadership meetings, their session times, in, do you all call it a session?
Yeah. Or a church council.
It's all Presbyterian. Yeah. Okay. So the session, the Central Leadership Group, they meet monthly and they meet for 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 if something big is going on. 1 hour of it is actually focused on the inner workings of the church. You know, let's go over the budget, let's receive reports from all these committees about this, that, etc. And that's absolutely critical and extremely important. But that's not the focus of the entire leadership meeting. Halfway through, they shift. And sometimes it's only 45 minutes of these 2-hour meetings are spent on matters internal to the church that keep the church running. The remaining time, either an hour or often an hour and 15 minutes, is spent reflecting on the lived faith of the leaders in the room.
Yes.
After all, as the pastor gently reminds them, as leaders, they should be modeling the behaviors and postures they hope to see in everyone who's part of the church. And they believe that Christians need one another and intentionality in order to follow Jesus and share in this way. And so there's this great example of a meeting that I got to be a part of, which was tricky because my Spanish is not great, but here goes. Leadership team meeting is scheduled. It's about a month and a half before the men's FIFA World Cup tournament.
Okay.
These are Spanish speakers and come from cultures where they are all soccer or football loving countries and cultures, and the World Cup would galvanize the attention and kind of trigger all these gatherings of friends and family in kind of the way that, at least for us, the Christmas season does. Everybody comes and gathers for a few weeks on end, taking time off work, traveling, etc. So at this leadership team meeting, the question was, how, when, and where each leader would be involved with the 2-week-long World Cup and that final match in particular, and what a Christian witness might look like during World Cup. They had an open conversation about the temptations of World Cup. The temptations to just stay together with a few close-knit people, enjoying each other's company alone. They talked about other kinds of temptations that might come up during World Cup. They talked about how many people, they started to name people who might be alone during this otherwise strong community time. They decided on people who needed to be intentionally invited into times of community. They decided on who would offer what kinds of open moments so that no one would be alone during World Cup viewing parties. They wanted to do World Cup, which was a huge gathering in this particular community, in a manner that glorifies Christ. And in the end, what they decided is to each leader would host a party. One would be at the church building, open to anyone. That was designed to provide place for anyone who did not have safe space and people. That would not just be one party, there would be several of those, but 1/3 of the group would do that as leaders of the church. 1/3 of the leaders would be hosting parties in their home and invite as many people in the church and have those people invited to also bring others. And then the third was commissioned basically to host on behalf of other people, be they neighbors, coworkers, whoever, and to really just think intentionally about who might be overlooked during this time and to invite them in as Christ would. There was no altar call or cards passed out at these families that invited them to a gathering of the church. The point was they wanted to be intentional about their Christian witness out, scattered, in their daily lives. And so they were talking about it and making time to talk about it in the actual leadership team meetings. And they do this every month.
Sure.
So does that, the gathered, it's not a versus, we're always a both, but the focus really was forever on how we gather. And now, if we can really do that well and focus on that alongside what we do when we scatter and what our lives look like as we go from this place, well, that's an important shift.
Absolutely fascinating. And I think that gives us a tremendous amount to talk about in the last of our interactive sessions, which for us will be at 11:30 today. To tease these topics out, to talk about, the difference between, or the absolute emphasis on the financial infrastructure questions, to the reputational and social capital, and developing ways even through those callings to sustain the congregation and to develop its ministry. And then this notion of church gathered and scattered, because I think our pastors, our church leaders who are part of this conference will be able to relate to that very well, because we spend all our money, or most of our money, and most of our staff energy, and most of our building, on that Sunday meeting. And if there happen to be a few meetings during the week, midweek and so on, that's also for that purpose. And we have a lot of us have buildings for that purpose alone. And the church scattered idea, is a bit foreign to us. We don't know quite what to do when we're not together in the church. I like to talk about the fact that we built for ourselves a missional, the old lighthouse story. We built for ourselves a community which has become more and more about us and less about the world that Christ died to save. Dallas Willard talks about becoming apprentices of Jesus in the world, and the fact is we've fallen behind, on that injunction, and we've become spectators. Or everything focused on this gathered community where we feel comfortable and safe, and have created a worldview and a way of doing things, a custom, all the paraphernalia that we need, and yet fewer and fewer of us are sent out into the world, or hear the call of Christ to go out into the world and make disciples. We're quite happy to be a disciple, but making disciples, surely that's Jesus's business and not mine.
Interesting. There's a great quote by William Sloane Coffin.
Oh, yeah, the Riverside Church.
Exactly. Civil rights, peace activist, Presbyterian pastor, UCC pastor, Riverside Church, you got it. He once wrote, "Most church boats don't like to be rocked. They prefer to lie at anchor rather than go places in stormy seas.
Right.
But that's because we Christians view the church as the object of our love instead of the subject and instrument of God's." I find that so powerful.
Very helpful.
Because the gathered church, and we all have done this for a while, but really focusing on the church, the metrics we choose, all kind of to measure how the church as an object is doing, viewing the church as an object of our love instead of an instrument of God's. I think that this shift that includes a focus on the church scattered is an effort to return to that sense that the church has been called into being for God's sovereign purposes, God's holy purposes, as an instrument of God's for particular calls. They start with a compelling why that then infuels what we do and how we do it. But it's about why we do it in the first place. And people trust our whys. When they know why we're doing what we're doing, they trust us.
Yes.
When they just see what we're doing or how we're doing it, that can have an iffier reception.
Yeah.
So this shift is interesting. Do we have time for a short story? I have another example.
We do. Perhaps a last story before we wrap up, and then good. Go ahead.
This is just a short thing that one church named Kairos has done, as they have really leaned into a more balanced focus, not just a focus on the church gathered, but really a focus also on the church scattered. They have small groups. They set them up to be geographically based. And in the small groups, what they did is they set it up so in their church budget, there is money for each group not to spend on itself, but for the actual small group to spend 1 week out of every month engaging the community in a way that the local community has decided they need. So the small group rhythm, and I'm just going to cut to the chase in favor of time, but it goes like this. Week 1, Bible study. Week 2, they've set up the small groups so that they are not closed systems where anybody new will feel awkward and out of place and like there's all these insider conversations that already happen. Week 2 is Friend Night, where there are conversations around faith and local events. They often relate to the Bible study the week before, but it is designed for people to invite newcomers. They can come once, that can be their entry point to being a regular part. Week 3, Bible study, still kind of dealing with the same topic, but week 4 is the community night. And the community night is expected that the group will either as a whole go and do something, or if you as an individual know that there is a person in your life who needs you to call on them, to go take them for coffee, to have dinner, to show up, to clean the house, to do whatever it is, then those people are encouraged to go and do that and be intentional about reaching out in the name of Christ, yes, but not overtly like that. Not, hi, I'm here because Christ sent me, but you know what I mean. And so this is the rhythm of their small groups. And for community night, in the budget, each small group, if they need to or want to, can apply for money if there is a particular project at like the local school or the whatever, where there is something needed. And, obviously a group decides whether you get the money, but this is one way they've really focused on being the church scattered as they've set up their small groups. What
a great idea. What a fantastic idea. That's great. Lindsay, any last remarks that you have? This is our last recorded session. Of course, we're going to have the last interactive session at 11:30.
I am honored and deeply grateful to be here. George, it's always fun to be with you. I only wish I were there to actually get to meet the rest of you. I am, even as a little girl, I dreamed of living in Southern Africa. I don't know why, but this was always my dream. So for whatever reason, you have a special place in my heart. But I'm grateful. I wish you many blessings on your ministry. And I hope that grappling with these shifts that are not binary, it's not from one to the other, but that are simply deep postures and mindsets common in the broader world that have resonance, and really I think they can be helpful as we adopt our own postures for the emerging era. I appreciate the chance to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you so very much for the insight that you've given us, which is, of course, based on your research. And yes, it would have been wonderful to have an in-person, and perhaps we'll work towards that in the post-COVID world. But this conference has kind of been very different from any of the ones before, and has allowed us to have the benefit of a wonderful international speaker as you are. And I'm very grateful for the interaction that we've had. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.